Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're going to talk about the basics of on-campus interviewing, or OCI. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Conference, and I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about OCI, or on-campus interviewing. This is the annual rite of passage where thousands of law students try to secure BigLaw summer associate positions for the next summer. We've got 2 other detailed episodes from the early days of the podcast that you can check out for more details on OCI. One covers the bidding and the first interview, and the other covers the details of callback interviews. You can find links to these in the show notes. But in today's episode, we're going to talk at a higher level about all of the aspects of OCI, and you can listen to the other ones for a deeper dive into the specifics.
All right, so right now it's midsummer, and most people who are doing OCI are probably thinking about bidding for firms. But before we get into that process, let's talk a little bit about how this works in general. So what's the basic overview here? What are people trying to do?
So a basic overview is that large firms hire summer associates after their second year of law school for an extended, quote-unquote, interview process, which also includes wining and dining and like going on trips on boats and all sorts of crazy other activities. But and what the OCI process is that's really how you get these positions. But I think what's kind of crazy about the OCI process, for those who aren't familiar with it, is it doesn't happen right before the summer before your second year. It actually typically starts the summer between your first and second year.
Yeah, so you're basically interviewing for this job essentially almost a year in advance.
Exactly.
Just pretty weird. And if people are not aware, not only do you get wined and dined, you also get paid typically the same amount as a first-year associate. So
that is the best part, I'll be honest.
Yeah, so it's a pretty lucrative summer job if you can secure one.
Exactly, which is, I think, definitely one of the motivations for doing OCI is not to just get access to one of these jobs after the fact, but also to help pay some bills by working over the summer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you do 8 to 10 weeks, which is pretty normal at a firm, you can, pay a large percentage of your living expenses and or tuition for the next semester or the next year. So, it definitely can be something that's worth looking into.
It was pretty exciting when I got my first paycheck during my summer associate job. It was like, here you go, credit card company. Done.
Exactly. Credit card debt paid off. Thanks. Exactly. Next week.
And when you're in law school, it can be pretty exciting to see actual money kind of coming in. So you do these initial interviews.
But before we even get there, I mean, how do we even get these interviews? Right?
Oh, it's a good idea. Yeah, you typically have to do some sort of a bidding or resume drop. It depends on what the terminology is around your school.
Yeah, so basically a bunch of firms, depending on your school, there may be fewer or more firms. If you're at one of these top schools, like I went to Columbia, you've got literally hundreds of firms from around the country who send representatives to do these interviews. But other places, it may be more local, or it may be fewer people. So not like a huge, group of firms that are interviewing. But I would say most firms have at least something, or most schools have at least something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if you go to a more regional law school, the school typically has relationships with certain big firms that really funnel people through. So, there's always going to be some sort of opportunities, but there are some firms that may just not show up to your school, and that's just kind of life. You would have to get into those firms through a different channel, which some people do, but it's not as typical. Most people just go through the OCI process.
Yeah, so the OCI process is all these firms say, yes, we are interested in potentially hiring students from this school. All the rising 2Ls at the school look at these firms and they say, okay, like here's who I'd like to work for. I'd like to interview with these people. And depending on the school, you may just be able to pick, or they may have certain requirements that you have to meet in terms of GPA. One of the things we'll talk about later is, you really need to understand your school's process.
Right.
Because you don't want to be wasting bids on things that are never going to happen and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, hopefully if all goes well, it's almost like the medical match. You get some sort of interview with some firm that you are potentially interested in working for. And in some cases, you'll do all of these at once in a series of a couple of days. Typically, they call them on-campus interviewing, but often on campus is not really accurate. It might be at a hotel. I know that's how Columbia did them at the time. Or it might be actually at your school in a conference room or something like that.
Yeah, it was at my school, they did them in the library study rooms, which were all glass.
Oh, gosh.
So when you were doing the interview, typically your back was to the glass, but everybody walking by knew who was in what room. It was really screwed up.
Yeah, that's weird. Well, no, I mean, my school, they did them at the Doubletree Suites in Midtown Manhattan. So you're in like Midtown. I think it was right at like Times Square. So it's like, August, late July, early August. It's scorching hot in New York, like the worst time of year. You're getting off the subway into like the crush of Times Square to do these interviews, and then you're doing these interviews in a hotel room, which is super weird. I mean, at least it was a suite, but people would the people you're interviewing with would leave the door to the bedroom open. It's just like really awkward.
Especially in a profession with a bit of a sordid history about sexual harassment and things like that.
No, I mean, literally the very first interview I did was like blatant sexual harassment to the point that I refused to do the callback. Wow. And they asked me why, and I told them why, and the recruiter was mortified.
That's awful. I didn't have anything that intense happen at all, but I did have one interview where the woman maybe allowed me to say 5 words. She just talked about herself the entire time, and I walked out and went, definitely not getting a call back there. She knows nothing about me. Well,
I mean, some people just like talking about themselves.
Yeah, she really thought very highly of herself. So very interesting.
So basically the point is you'll do these initial interviews. Hopefully you do a number of them. Some of them go well. Some of them don't go so well. Yep. If they do go well, then typically you're invited to do a callback interview, which is when you actually visit the firm. And you do a series of interviews over the course typically of a few hours. Have some sort of meal, often lunch, sometimes dinner, with people who work at the firm. And then if the callback goes well, you'll receive an offer to go there for the summer, which then you can accept or reject. And if your summer goes well, then you'll theoretically get an offer to return permanently after graduation. So there are a couple of things to note. I mean, one of these, I think people don't typically look at this very much, but there are rules about all this stuff, right?
Oh, yeah. And I had no idea there were rules governing any of this when I was in school.
Yeah, but there are actually. There's a whole process, like NALP, the National Association of Legal Professionals or something like that. They actually publish guidelines on how many offers can you have open at any point? Like when do you need to accept or reject an offer, that kind of thing. So these are things you actually probably want to be familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think it makes a lot of sense. And, you should also try and talk to people, I think, in the school, if you have any mentors, through any of your mentorship programs, or talk to career services about what the process typically looks like at your school. Because it is important to understand that regionally or in different communities, what's accepted is slightly different. So it's really important to kind of learn as much as you can about the firms, about kind of the players involved, about what typically happens before you go through the full interview process.
Yeah, and you definitely don't want to be, that person who sort of accidentally doesn't know the rules and is holding open like 3 offers when you're only allowed to have 1 offer at that point in time, and your offers get revoked or something like that. That's your worst case scenario. So, you don't need to be paranoid, but you need to have a basic understanding of like, all right, this is like, these are the expectations, and this is kind of like what I'm allowed to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so different schools have different processes for bidding or dropping resumes, and it's important to understand what your school does and what you can do to get ready so you're ready to participate when it's quote unquote kind of open season.
Yeah, and I think that comes up faster than people sometimes realize. And I think people understandably have a lot of questions about bidding. Like it's kind of this black box. And, ideally your school will provide you some sort of information about the type of candidate that each firm is looking for. So are they looking for, certain grades? Do they want certain extracurriculars? Like, do they require that you be on law review? And as with most things in life, you can ignore these at your peril.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I think I do remember them being a very specific list. You know, if you weren't on the law review, there were some firms who would just never even talk to you.
Yeah, and you know, some students are like, well, but I'm exceptional in these other ways and I should be considered. It's like, okay, you know, if there's a firm that you're really dying to work for some reason and you're not meeting their qualifications, but for whatever reason you think that they should pick you anyway, you know, feel free to have one bid that you apply to this knowing it's probably not going to work out. But just like when you're applying to law school, you know, you need your target firms, your safety firms, and your reach firms.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it.
You know, you don't want to be spending all of your bids on people that have said only they want law review students and you're not on law review.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, you may be a special butterfly, but somebody's got a checklist and they're like, does this person meet our qualifications? No. Moving on.
Yeah. And I think it's harsh sometimes to think in that way, but you have to realize these recruiters are going through stacks and stacks and stacks of applicants. And you have to, you know, they're giving those requirements as some thresholds so they can thin out the stack and only have to in detail go through the people that they actually think are the truly viable candidates.
Right. And the firms too. I mean, I know when I was working, we would literally get memos for people who were going to do on-campus interviewing being like, do not bother sending us resumes if people do not meet X, Y, and Z requirement.
Right.
You know, and it's going to make the person who's doing the interviewing look bad if they send back a stack of people who basically they've been told are not, you know, officially qualified.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not to say that, you know, you'll never in 1,000 years get an interview at a place that technically you don't meet their GPA requirement, but you have to realize that it's kind of a, you know, you're taking a risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And then did you have to do individual cover letters for each of the firms you were bidding for?
I don't think so. That would have been such a waste of time.
Oh, we did. Maybe that is and that may have changed since I was doing that, but we had to do individual cover letters for all of the firms. And I heard from a recruiter friend at the firm that I ended up working for talk about all of the mistakes she saw in cover letters and how she would pretty much throw away your resume if it was, say, addressed to the wrong person.
Name spelled wrong, firm spelled wrong,
firm spelled wrong,
the name of the firm wrong if they've merged.
Yeah. So if that is part of what you're doing as part of this process, make sure you double, triple, and quadruple check things, because the easiest way to like lose a job is by making it so they don't even really go through your materials.
Yeah, I mean, you're just going to destroy your chances at that point. Yeah. You know, these things happen to everyone. I accidentally, at some point, apparently had interviewed with a firm in DC that I thought was in New York and didn't realize until I was in the middle of the interview. I mean, you know, it happens. They had offices everywhere. Apparently I checked the wrong box. And so, you know, she turns to me and says, so why do you want to be in DC? And there was this pause for a moment while I'm thinking to myself, DC, why am I in this interview? Yeah. So suffice it to say, I did not get a call back there.
No. But what about putting together your resumes? I mean, I think, that is something that you definitely don't want to leave to the last minute and have ready to go when this process gets kicked off.
Yeah, you want to make sure by the time that you're submitting anything that, you know, it's been double checked by you. You've probably had other people look at it. You've gotten some feedback on it. Everything is perfect. I mean, if you're interviewing in multiple locations, ideally you would probably have a separate resume for each location because, you know, even something as simple as having a mailing address in California, if you're in school in New York, can make a difference.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Because firms typically don't want to invest the large amount of money that they're going to invest in people who wouldn't consider moving there after school.
Yeah, and I think people who do not have a strong connection to a certain location where they do want to work, you just have to be cognizant of this. And this is, you know, this comes down to like, how many places should I bid on? Like, how competitive am I? You know, if you've never set foot in the state of California and you're claiming that you want to work in San Francisco or you want to work in LA, they're going to be skeptical. I mean, they were skeptical of me, and I'd lived there for years. I'd gone to graduate school there. I'd worked there, and people were still skeptical because I was in law school in New York. So, you know, this is all about sort of figuring out how competitive you are as a candidate in the locations that you're applying in.
For sure. And even if you are considering different regions within a state. I mean, I was originally from the Central Valley, and I was talking to some of the firms there when I was considering my options. This was for my first summer, but one of their big concerns was we don't want people coming and making money off of us and then taking their next job back in the Bay Area. That's really not our game plan. Our game plan is to try and see if you can work here permanently, and you're going to have to convince us that you're going to come back here and work. And I mean, I sympathize with the firms who are, I mean, these summer programs are expensive.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
They really do want you to want to be there. And I think it's an important question to ask yourself, because this OCI process can really lead to where you end up after graduation or what you're doing. And you should make sure it's in a location that you're comfortable with, at a firm you're comfortable with. Just don't decide to bid on every possible firm because you desperately need this job. That's not necessarily the best way to go about this.
No, I mean, like with anything, the person who, drops targeted resumes and potentially cover letters at, say, 10 or 10 places that are, going to be a great fit where they're clearly within the guidelines for what they're looking for, is going to have better success than someone who applies to 30 or 40 places just totally randomly because they're like, oh, I don't know, like maybe I'd like to be in Nevada, maybe I'd like to be in Illinois, maybe I'd like to be in Texas. I mean, that's crazy.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think students should go about learning about these firms and, what they should even care about? Like, does it matter what sort of law that they practice and stuff like that?
No, I think ideally you want your career goals to align with what the firm is good at. Mm-hmm. And different firms some of them don't even have certain practice areas. I mean, the firm I worked at full time, didn't have corporate work. They just didn't. So, if you dropped a resume and, somebody, you went into you got an interview and you go in and you say, oh, what kind of work are you interested in? And you tell them mergers and acquisitions, they're pretty much going to show you the door right then because they literally don't do that. And you should know that.
Right. I also think it's important if there are areas of law that you are really interested in, or even certain groups of clients that you're really interested in, that you do that research too. I mean, I remember doing a first run interview with a firm that did tobacco litigation defense, and sitting in that interview going, I don't want to wake up in the morning and do tobacco litigation defense. That is just not what I want to do, and that's okay. They would rather you not take their money and work there if that's something you don't want to do.
And that's the thing. I mean, people who work there, they've made their peace with that, and they understand that a lot of people are not going to want to do this. So they're probably going to ask you about it. And if you are surprised to learn that this is the type of work you might be doing, it's probably not going to be very impressive. You need to have a basic familiarity with what are the practice areas, what are these people known for? How do they perceive themselves? What kind of culture do they think they have? Because otherwise, you're just going in blind.
Yeah. I mean, I ended up working in an office where a good chunk of the litigation practice was products liability defense. And so if you are not okay with that would have been an awful office to show up at. There was bankruptcy and other stuff happening in that office too, but the bread and butter of that office, it had been a merged law firm, was their big products liability group. And that's what the majority of the casework came from.
Yeah, I mean, I summered at a place where they were really known for their corporate practice. And I wanted to do litigation. And I did have these conversations when I was interviewing, do you think it's a good place to be a litigator? And people tell you whatever they want to tell you. But the reality was, no, it was not a good place to be a litigator because those were not the people who were in charge of things. Mm-hmm. And so when I worked after my clerkship, I worked at a place that was basically known for doing IP litigation. Mm-hmm. And I was very happy doing IP litigation. I was good at it. I had a good background for it. That was just a much better fit.
Mm-hmm. I also think it can be important to, depending on, again, your school and what firms are coming to your school, to keep an open mind to possibly some maybe smaller firms, more regional firms that still have some smaller summer programs. They'll probably still come due on-campus interviewing. I interviewed with a couple of those firms. I got an offer for one that I didn't end up taking, but it was a different type of a summer program and it would have been a very different experience. And there's a lot to offer sometimes with these smaller offices, in the way that you can get much more exposure. Maybe you'll work more closely with some of the attorneys. Maybe the pay won't be quite as high, but maybe the job satisfaction will be a little bit higher, or you think that in the end game, it might be a better fit for you long-term as a career path. So I think it is important to keep your mind kind of open. And sometimes if you don't have a huge summer program where they're just funneling money into the social aspect of it, you might end up having more of a working summer, but that also could be a big boost to your resume and your experience too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even if you think of like the big law world in New York City, even within that world, there are firms that are much smaller and much scrappier and more entrepreneurial, and there are other ones that are not. And so, it's important to consider like where you think you might fit in. And again, to play this long game. It's not just that you're getting this job for a few months. Ideally, this is going to be the job that you have after you graduate.
Yeah. It's just so easy to get caught up in the machine,
Oh, yeah. Everybody's like, yeah, if you get an offer at Cravath, you have to take it. But you're like, maybe I don't want to wear a suit every day. Like, maybe I would hate working at Cravath. Maybe this is not the best choice for me. There's a lot of pressure on people to sort of take the more traveled pathway on a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. And I think use the OCI process to learn more about what this life is like. I think that's one of the things that people forget about the summer associate process. It's also you interviewing the firm as to whether or not you think it's a good fit.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure we all have crazy interview stories of, I had interviews where someone would close the door and say, like, do you want me to tell you the truth about what it's like to work here? And you're like, yes, please. Mm-hmm. And, that's one data point. Like, maybe you don't take the word of that disaffected associate as gospel, but I don't think you should ignore it either.
No, I definitely had some, I didn't have anything that extreme, but I remember, they have you typically when you go on a callback to meet with a few different associates. And sometimes, just being like, so, just fishing, right? And then when they're really not talking to you about anything, and there's just like no information coming out of their mouths about their experience working there, that's a lot of really great information too.
Right. And one thing people sometimes don't understand is after you have the offer from a firm, typically at that point, they're happy to have you come back and say, go to lunch with a few associates or something like that. And that's when you can really, ask your pointed questions. I don't think in an initial interview or even in a callback, people should be asking, well, what are your billable hour requirements? Mm-hmm. I think that's probably inappropriate. But after you have the offer, I would say you better ask them that.
Yeah. And they even had some events for us when we had open offers so we could meet more lawyers and have more conversations when they were trying to recruit us to accept.
Exactly. I mean, at that point, that's that's like the apex of your power with the firm is before you've accepted that offer. You can basically, you can ask for whatever you want. Like, I want to talk to this person who's in a practice area that I want to work in, or I want to come back and go to lunch with, someone who's like a first year and a third year to get their perspective or whatever it is. I mean, obviously it can't be too obnoxious, but you can get a lot at that point.
No, and I think a great question to ask when you meet with those people, and Alison, this is your question that I love that we do on a lot of our interviews, is just, what does the day in the life look like? When
are you showing up?
Like, what's a typical day? And it's such a brilliant question that I think so often people really forget to ever ask that question.
Yeah, and it can give you a lot of information, like what time of day are they showing up? Like, you can do the math on, are you eating all 3 meals at your desk?
Right.
Yeah, and again, like, you have to take a lot of this with a grain of salt, but I think you can gather a lot of information. Sometimes people just feel like, oh, I'm so lucky to have this offer, like I have to take it immediately. But that's not necessarily the case. Like, you need to be strategic about this.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about maybe getting back to that first round kind of process. So how many interviews do you think you should do?
Well, I'll give you the lawyerly answer, which is as many as you need to, but no more than that.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you don't want to under or oversell yourself. I mean, I think I probably did more interviews than I needed to because I was like, I'm on the law review at Columbia. I probably could have dropped 20 or 30% of those and done just, had exactly the same results.
Mm-hmm. How many first rounds did you do? Do you remember?
I don't even remember. Probably 10 or 15.
Yeah, I think I did 12.
Something like that.
That's a lot.
Yeah. I don't know. Occasionally you're just like, God, why was I talking to those people? Like, that was, But I mean, I think you've got to evaluate realistically how competitive are you? What is the prestige level of your school? What are your grades? What are your extracurriculars? Where are you interviewing? Certain places are harder or less hard to get jobs in. What are your connections to those places? Are you good at interviewing? I mean, for me, like, I'm a pretty good interviewer. I'm sure you are as well. There's probably a reason we do this podcast.
Probably.
But, some people are not good interviewers.
It's true.
And if you know that about yourself, you need to sign up for more interviews and you need to practice. But if you know that you're not someone who can do that initial rapport, or you're not very comfortable in an initial interview setting, you're going to need to do more interviews because it's going to be more of a crapshoot.
And, I think it's also interesting because sometimes you don't really know when a firm's going to be a good fit. I mean, it feels a lot like dating.
Yeah.
Right? I was actually just
reading...
It's
like the Tinder of law firms.
It is kind of it. I'm reading Aziz Ansari's book on modern romance. Have you read this?
No, I read about it.
Anyway, I think I was traveling and needed something like mindless to read. So I'm like halfway through it. And it's hilarious if anyone wants a good study break book. But I'm in this chapter talking about online dating. And one of the things he was talking about is that statistically, we are really bad at picking our own partners on online dating. Because often what we really want is not actually what we think we want.
Right. Or what we'll admit that we want.
Or that we will admit that, but that's a good point. So I was thinking about that, and then I was like thinking about OCI, and sometimes, we don't even really know what firms are going to be the best fit, because it is very hard to know exactly what the corporate culture is, exactly.
Well, I mean, most law students have literally never set foot in a law firm before they do these interviews. So how could you know?
And there are some, like I was talking about that interview where the woman didn't let me speak. I was actually really interested in that firm. Mm-hmm. But it was pretty clear to me that they weren't interested in me. Or she was a terrible interviewer, one of the two.
Well, which is not uncommon.
Uncommon.
I mean, people don't typically get really any training or much training in how to do these interviews. So you're going to get bad interviewers.
Yeah, but does that mean, like, maybe I would have been an okay fit for that firm? But, I also, the firm I ended up taking the offer from, it was my last first round interview. At that point, I already had a couple of offers. I was so burned out on the process because my process wasn't like over just a couple of days. It went over a few weeks. And I was just like, I will just go to this one last interview, whatever. The partner canceled on me. So it was supposed to be like first thing in the morning. And I ended up having to come back at like the end of the day and stay in my suit all day. And that made me cranky. Like I was definitely not at my most charismatic, but he was in a kind of an old school litigator. And he thought my somewhat aloofness and snarky responses to some of his comments were quite endearing. And then he said I was his favorite candidate.
Well, Lee, I have to say, I think this sounds a lot like the story of how you met your husband. So.
That's true. That is true.
Where you'd given up on dating, and it was one last horrible date that you had to bother with.
That's true.
Hey, turned out great.
And I didn't even blow dry my hair. Yes, exactly. So, so there's a lot to be said for, being relaxed and keeping an open mind, because you do never know when it's going to be a good fit. And actually, that firm, in a lot of ways was a really good fit for me. So I'm glad I went to that interview. So you do have to somewhat keep an open mind and realize that there's a little bit of, I guess, like fate and luck or whatever at play. But it's just, you'll learn so much more during the process. Don't make too many judgment calls in the beginning.
Yeah. And on that topic, let's talk really briefly. Like, what are these interviewers looking for? I mean, some of it's just numbers. Like, what are your grades?
Sure.
What are your statistics? Blah, blah, blah. But also they're looking for someone who's sort of personable, who can get along, someone they wouldn't mind being stuck on a plane with if you have to fly to a deposition, somebody you wouldn't mind being awake with for 48 hours if you're at trial or doing a deal. I mean, a lot of it is about sort of fit, which is, fair and not fair.
Mm-hmm. I think they're also looking for professionalism, which I also think is important to keep in mind, especially if you are kind of new to a professional job. If this is your first job and you're not comfortable in a suit, you really want to practice doing these interviews, maybe even do some practice interviews with career services, practice interviews with family members, informational interviews with possibly people in your network to get more comfortable, just kind of dressed up and like playing this role.
Talking to grown-ups,
who
are like real grown-ups.
Yeah. And I think it's also, so that professionalism and also confidence. I was also interviewing mostly for litigation. Litigators can smell fear. That's like what they're trained to do. And if you walk in and you are unsure of yourself, they're going to make it really, really hard on you.
Yeah, and they're going to ask you about the thing that you're really hoping they don't ask you about. If you have one bad grade on your transcript, you need to have a story ready for what happened, because I guarantee you they're going to ask you, so what happened in contracts?
Yep.
And it's not going to be any nicer than that.
Yeah.
And it might be less nice.
It might be less nice.
That's about, I mean, we both done these interviews, and like, you don't want to be mean to people, but part of it's just like, you're used to sort of cutting to the chase as an attorney. And it's not like, so, it looks like most of your grades are pretty good, but then I see this one. Like, that's not the way that this goes.
No, warm and fuzzy is not something I would say comes up much in the interview process.
No, I mean, for me, if you have a strange background, like, you need to have a story about that. I have a really weird resume, and pretty much every single person I interviewed with immediately asked me about it. And if I had been uncertain or didn't have a story prepared about, how this made sense and why it was helpful to them, I was going to be dead in the water.
Yep. Oh, I had in a callback, I had the weirdest callback at this one firm where they literally had like 12 people in the room in a U shape in the conference room. And I was sitting on the table. I mean, they were litigators, and it definitely felt like I was on trial. And one of the partners just looked at me and said, well, it seems like you change jobs every few years. Why would I ever think you'd work here for very long? And of course, at this point in the interview process, I'm thinking, I don't think I'm going to work here at all.
You're like, yes, you're exactly right. Can I leave now?
I know.
Yeah, I mean, God, you just get so many weird... I mean, you're dealing with weird people a lot of the time. You just get so many weird things happen. People tell you really weird stuff. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just because I have like a personality that people think they can, I don't know, like offload themselves. But there were times I was just like, why are you telling me this?
Yeah. Yeah. I also think it's important to have some standard answers to those interview questions. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Or my personal favorite, which is, what is your greatest weakness? And don't make your answer, I'm too detail oriented.
I'm just such a perfectionist.
I'm such a perfectionist.
I just work too hard.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, keep
in mind, like, you're interviewing with people, and they have pretty good bullshit detectors. So, and like, I mean, yeah, when you're doing these interviews, you're like, you don't want to be mean to people, but you also just want someone who's like a normal person, who's not like feeding you some line of crap about like this, because you're like, I don't want to deal with this person on an ongoing basis. Like, I just want someone who like, can just like do what needs to be done, not cause a lot of problems, and just like be okay. That's like, the standards really aren't actually that high.
Yeah.
You don't have to like hit it out of the park.
Yeah. And I know in our other podcasts we talk about this in more detail, but again, especially if you're someone who's not used to being in this professional environment and getting dressed up and things like that, make sure, you have a comfortable suit, you know how, especially for women, that you're going to do your hair so you're not doing fidgety things like pushing your bangs out of your eyes, or, playing with your hair, or playing with your jewelry, or things like that. If you're a man, make sure you're not like tugging at your tie constantly.
Rubbing your crotch.
Right. Exactly.
It happens. I've seen it. They're just like, what are you doing? Stop.
But, it is really important that you kind of get comfortable in this persona. And it is like, I used to do theater and stuff like that when I was young. Like, it is acting. I mean, you're playing a role. It's a performance.
You're performing as a potential lawyer.
Right. And so, you have to be comfortable in that role. And just like if you were getting up on stage, you need to practice. So you have your act together and you don't make mistakes that could be easily avoided.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've already touched briefly on this, but, the basic process of callbacks and things like that is pretty much just the same interview over and over. More of the same, more explaining that bad grade in contracts. Hopefully you're getting pretty good at it by the time you've done like your 10th interview. And you will get better at these. I mean, in terms of scheduling, if there's any way you can schedule your least favored firms first, that's actually better because you'll just be more comfortable. One thing I actually want to touch on briefly. So I've been getting some questions recently from people who are transferring. So it's this kind of weird process where like, you were maybe going to do OCI at one school, and now you're going to do it at another, and maybe you're not even sure which firm or which school that's going to be because you've still got outstanding applications that you haven't gotten an answer on. I mean, how do people start to navigate that?
I think once you definitely have the school that you think you're going to go to, I think your best bet is to start doing OCI at that school and remove any applications you may have had at your old school.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people end up in this position where, like, they did it at one school, but now they're transferring because they didn't know that. I mean, basically, you just have to use your best judgment here and try to be considerate of other people. I mean, if you, as Lee said, if you know that you're leaving a school and you have an offer somewhere else, just go ahead and cancel those interviews. Like, let someone else do them.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's, you basically, I have a friend who's a recruiter and she's like, yeah, sometimes we would see people twice and we would kind of be like, what's going on? Oh yeah, right. You transferred. Okay. It's not like the biggest deal in the world, but you just have to kind of play it, in a reasonable manner.
Yeah, exactly. So just remember that you want to be, professional, and it is a bit of a negotiation as you're trying to navigate kind of this limbo you're in. But I thought we were actually recently talking to somebody in a transfer situation, mentioned that you can sometimes try and hurry some of the schools along to get you back information quickly so you can decide where you're going to do your bidding.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've already, if you have a couple of outstanding applications, but you already have an offer at a very good school, it's perfectly fine to email or call those schools and be like, hey, this is what I need to know. I need to know an answer, essentially.
Yeah.
It can be a good leveraging topic. All right. Well, I think unfortunately we're just about out of time since we've already done 2 podcasts on this topic. You can also listen to those. Lee, is there anything else you want to add at this point?
No, I think it might also be good to listen to our authenticity podcast as we try and navigate this and realize, what sort of path you're looking for out of OCI. Because I think, in the end, what we hope for you is that you end up finding a firm that's a good fit for as long as you decide you want to be there. But, you do have to think critically about what you want, what your definition of success is. Typically, it doesn't just include dollar signs, and make sure that as you go through this process.
They all pretty much pay the same thing anyway.
Yeah, so. That's right. So go through this process with that in mind. So maybe in the show notes, we're going to go ahead and add our authenticity episode.
I think that's a good idea because I think the thing to keep in mind, as we talked about with this performance, is yes, you're sort of performing aspects of this professionalism, but you also shouldn't be doing something that seems like really not what you want to be doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes because we would really appreciate it. And you can subscribe so you don't miss anything. We usually release new episodes on Monday. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to us at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening. We'll talk soon, and good luck in your job hunt.